What if the person you trusted to get you home safe was the one in the most danger? What if the desire for a life you see on Instagram, a life of luxury and endless parties, could drive someone to commit the ultimate crime? Today's story is a chilling reminder that behind the perfect filters and curated smiles, a dark and desperate reality can be lurking. It's a story about two completely different worlds colliding in the most tragic way imaginable. But before we get into it, if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the shocking stories we uncover each week. The city of Viridia was a place of stark contrasts, a sprawling metropolis where dreams were both made and shattered with equal, unforgiving ferocity. In the shimmering heart of the financial district, glass and steel towers clawed at the sky, their brightly lit offices humming with the ceaseless thrum of commerce long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. Here, the air itself seemed to crackle with ambition, the streets a river of luxury vehicles and impeccably dressed figures rushing from one important engagement to the next. Further out, in the sprawling suburbs that radiated from the city's core like the spokes of a great, uneven wheel, the energy was different. Here, the houses were more modest, the streets quieter, and the dreams smaller, more focused on the simple comforts of family and a life lived with a quiet sense of dignity. It was in one of these neighborhoods, in a small but immaculately kept house with a garden that was his wife's pride and joy, that David Chun began his day. At 47, David was a man who had learned to weather the storms of life with a quiet resilience. He had spent 20 years as a loyal and dedicated employee at a mid-sized accounting firm, a job that had provided a comfortable, if not extravagant, life for him, his wife, May, and their two children. He had been a good provider, a loving husband, and a doting father. He had coached his son's little league team, helped his daughter with her math homework, and never missed a school play or a parent-teacher conference. His life had been a steady, predictable rhythm of work, family, and the simple pleasures of a life well lived. Then the storm had come. The company had downsized, and David, along with a dozen other longtime employees, had been laid off. It was a brutal, impersonal blow, a cold and calculated business decision that had shattered the foundation of his world. For months, he had sent out resumes, gone on interviews, and networked with old colleagues, but the job market was unforgiving for a man his age. The rejections had been polite but firm, each one a fresh wave of disappointment that eroded a little more of his confidence. But David was not a man to be defeated. He had a family to support, and he would do whatever it took to provide for them. So, he had swallowed his pride and signed up to be a driver for a popular ride-sharing app. It was not the life he had envisioned for himself, but it was a living. His days were now a blur of unfamiliar faces and endless miles. His office a four-door sedan that was starting to show its age. He missed the easy camaraderie of his old office, the familiar routine, the sense of purpose that had come with his old job. But he never complained. He would simply smile, greet each passenger with a quiet courtesy, and focus on the one thing that mattered, his family. His first fare of the day was a young woman in a crisp business suit, her face illuminated by the glow of her smartphone, as she rattled off a series of curt instructions to someone on the other end of the line. She barely acknowledged his greeting, her world confined to the small screen in her hand. David drove her to a gleaming office tower in the heart of the financial district, the same building where he had once had an interview that had gone nowhere. He watched her disappear into the revolving doors, a pang of something he couldn't quite name, envy, perhaps, or a wistful longing for a life that was no longer his tugging at his heart. He shook off the feeling, reminding himself that such thoughts were a luxury he couldn't afford. He had a long day ahead of him, a full tank of gas, and a list of bills that seemed to grow longer with each passing week. He took a deep breath. The familiar scent of the air freshener his daughter had given him a small comfort, and tapped the screen of his phone to accept the next ride. Miles away, in a sprawling mansion nestled in the exclusive enclave of Crestwood Hills, Ethan Croft was just waking up. At 18, Ethan lived in a world that was the polar opposite of David's. His was a world of inherited wealth, of effortless privilege, where money was not a means to an end but a tool for crafting a life of carefully curated perfection. His father was a real estate mogul, his mother a celebrated interior designer, and their combined wealth had created a gilded cage for their only son, a world where every desire was instantly gratified, every whim indulged. Ethan's life was a performance, a carefully constructed illusion of a life lived without a care in the world. His social media accounts were a testament to this, a glossy, filtered feed of exotic vacations, designer clothes, and wild parties. He was handsome, charming, and popular, the king of his privileged social circle. But beneath the surface, a gnawing insecurity festered. He was terrified of being seen as anything less than perfect, of his carefully constructed facade cracking to reveal the ordinary, insecure young man beneath. He had become a slave to the expectations of his peers, to the endless cycle of one-upmanship that defined their world. And at the center of it all was Chloe Vance, his girlfriend, a girl who was as beautiful and as wealthy as he was. Chloe was the ultimate status symbol, the final piece in his carefully curated life. And he was terrified of losing her. The source of his current anxiety was a watch, a limited edition Audemars Piguet that had become the latest must-have accessory among his friends. Chloe had casually mentioned how much she loved it, and in Ethan's mind, buying it for her had become a matter of life and death. The only problem was the price tag, a staggering $50,000. He had already maxed out the generous allowance his parents gave him, and he knew they would never give him that kind of money for a watch. He had considered asking them, but the thought of their disappointed sighs, their gentle lectures about the value of money, was more than he could bear. He needed the money, and he needed it now. Desperation gnawed at him, a cold, hard knot in the pit of his stomach. He paced his cavernous bedroom, the plush carpet muffling his footsteps. His eyes scanned the room, a museum of his extravagant tastes. Designer clothes were strewn over a velvet armchair. The latest gaming console sat dormant on a sleek entertainment center, and a collection of expensive sneakers lined an entire wall. But none of it mattered. All he could think about was the watch, the symbol of his devotion to Chloe, the key to maintaining his place at the top of the social ladder. An idea began to form in his mind, a dark and dangerous thought that he initially pushed away. But it kept coming back, more insistent each time. He thought about the drivers who ferried him and his friends around the city, the anonymous figures behind the wheel of their ordinary cars. They were like ghosts, invisible, their lives a complete mystery. And they always dealt in cash, didn't they? Tips, off-the-books fares, that sort of thing. Surely they must carry a decent amount of cash with them. The thought was a spark in the darkness of his desperation, a spark that quickly grew into a raging fire. He told himself it was just a loan, that he would pay it back somehow. He just needed the money, and this was the easiest way to get it. He grabbed a black hoodie from his closet, pulled it over his head, and slipped a heavy, ornate letter opener from his father's study into his pocket. It felt cold and heavy in his hand, a strange and unsettling weight. He told himself it was just for show, to scare the driver, to make him cooperate. He used a burner app on his phone to request a ride, a new account with a fake name. He didn't want to leave a digital trail. He watched the app as a car approached his location, a simple, unassuming sedan. The driver's name was David. David was on his way home, looking forward to a quiet evening with his family. It had been a long day and he was tired. But then, a notification popped up on his phone. A new ride request, just a few blocks away. It was on his way, and the fare would be a welcome addition to his day's earnings. He accepted the ride. He pulled up to the designated address, a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood he didn't recognize. A young man in a black hoodie was waiting on the corner, his face obscured by the shadows of the late afternoon. He got into the back seat without a word. "Where to?" David asked, his voice friendly. The young man mumbled an address, a secluded spot on the outskirts of the city. David felt a flicker of unease, but he dismissed it. He had driven countless passengers to all sorts of places. This was no different. The drive was silent, the only sound the gentle hum of the engine and the rhythmic click of the turn signal. David tried to make small talk, But the young man in the back seat remained silent, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. David glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but he couldn't see his face. He followed the directions on his GPS, turning onto a deserted road that led to a small, abandoned park. He pulled the car over as instructed. "This is it," he said, turning to face his passenger. But the young man was no longer looking out the window. He was looking at David, his eyes cold and hard. And in his hand, he was holding a long, sharp letter opener. "Give me your money," he said, his voice barely a whisper. David's blood ran cold. He had never been in a situation like this before. He thought of May, of his children. He had to get home to them. Okay, just take it easy," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'll give you everything I have." He reached for his wallet, his hands shaking. He pulled out the wad of cash he had earned that day, a little over $200. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He handed the money to the young man, who snatched it from his hand. For a moment, David thought that would be the end of it. But then he saw the look in the young man's eyes, a look of cold, calculating greed. "That's it?" the young man sneered. "I know you guys carry more than that. Where's the rest of it?" "That's all I have, I swear," David pleaded. "I'm just a driver. I don't carry a lot of cash." The young man's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe him. He saw David's simple car, his worn clothes, and he saw a man who was lying to him, a man who was holding out on him. What happened next was a blur of violence and pain. The young man lunged forward, the letter opener flashing in the dim light of the car. David cried out, a sound of shock and agony that was quickly silenced. The young man, his heart pounding in his chest, looked down at what he had done. The sight of the blood, the stillness of the man in the driver's seat, sent a wave of panic through him. He had not meant for this to happen. Or had he? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he had to get out of there. He wiped the letter opener on the car seat, his hands trembling. He grabbed David's wallet, hoping to find more cash. But there was nothing but a few credit cards and a picture of a smiling woman and 2 children. He threw the wallet on the floor in disgust. He got out of the car and ran, the $200 clutched in his hand. He didn't look back. He just ran, the sound of his own ragged breathing filling his ears. He had the money for the watch. That was all that mattered. Back in the car, David Chun lay dying. His last thoughts of the family he would never see again. The city of Viridia, with its shimmering towers and its quiet suburbs, continued to hum with the ceaseless rhythm of life, oblivious to the small, brutal tragedy that had just unfolded on a deserted road on its outskirts. 2 worlds had collided, and one of them had been extinguished, all for the price of a glittering cage. The initial hours after the murder were a whirlwind of frantic energy and calculated composure for Ethan. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, the adrenaline coursing through his veins a potent cocktail of fear and exhilaration. He ditched the hoodie in a dumpster, the letter opener in a storm drain, and the burner phone in a river, severing every tangible link to the crime. By the time he slipped back into his lavish home, the first rays of dawn were painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. He showered, the hot water washing away the grime of the night, but not the stain on his soul. He looked at himself in the mirror, his reflection a stranger with haunted eyes. But then, he forced a smile, a practiced, charming smile that he had perfected over the years. The mask was back in place. The next day, he went to the most exclusive jewelry store in the city and bought the Audemars Piguet watch. The $200 he had stolen from David were a pathetic down payment. The rest he charged to a credit card his parents unknowingly funded. As the jeweler placed the watch in a velvet box, Ethan felt a surge of triumph. He had done it. He had gotten what he wanted. He posted a picture of the watch on his Instagram, the caption a simple but effective, "For the one and only at Chloe Vance." The likes and comments poured in, a digital chorus of approval that momentarily drowned out the nagging voice of his conscience. He presented the watch to Chloe that evening at a trendy, Michelin-starred restaurant. She was ecstatic, her eyes wide with delight, as she clipped the exquisite timepiece onto her delicate wrist. She leaned across the table and kissed him, A long, passionate kiss that tasted of expensive champagne and victory. For a fleeting moment, Ethan felt a sense of normalcy, a belief that he could outrun the consequences of his actions. He was Ethan Croft, the boy who had everything, and he would not let one mistake, one moment of madness, ruin it all. But the facade, however carefully constructed, was beginning to crumble. The nightmares started a few days later, vivid, terrifying flashes of David's face, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Ethan would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, the silence of his room a suffocating presence. He started to drink more, the alcohol a temporary anesthetic for his guilt. He became irritable and withdrawn, his easy charm replaced by a defensive arrogance. He lashed out at his parents, his friends, anyone who dared to question his behavior. He was a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Chloe was the first to notice the change. She had been initially swept up in the romance of the extravagant gift, but as the days turned into weeks, she couldn't ignore the growing darkness in Ethan's eyes. He was no longer the carefree, charismatic boy she had fallen for. He was a stranger, a moody, unpredictable presence who seemed to be haunted by a secret he refused to share. "Is everything okay, Ethan?" she asked one evening, as they were driving home from a party. He had been unusually quiet all night, his replies to her questions monosyllabic and curt. "I'm fine," he snapped, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel of his sports car. "Just tired." "You seem more than tired," she pressed, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been different lately, distant. Is it something I did?" "No, it's not you," he said, his voice softening slightly. He knew he was pushing her away, but he didn't know how to stop. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, and he was terrified of dragging her in with him. "Then what is it?" she asked, her hand resting on his arm. "You can talk to me, you know." He wanted to. He wanted to confess everything, to unburden himself of the terrible secret that was eating him alive. But he couldn't. He couldn't bear the thought of her looking at him with disgust, with revulsion. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He lied. "It's just my parents," he said, a plausible, if not entirely convincing, excuse. "They're putting a lot of pressure on me about college, about my future. It's just a lot to deal with right now." Chloe seemed to accept his explanation, but a seed of doubt had been planted. She had also found it strange that he had suddenly come into a large sum of money. He had always been generous, but the watch was on another level. When she had asked him about it, he had been evasive, muttering something about a lucky investment. But the pieces weren't adding up, and a sense of unease began to settle in her heart. Meanwhile, Detective Isabella Rossi was meticulously piecing together the puzzle of David Chen's murder. The crime scene had been a study in cold, calculated brutality. The victim had been stabbed multiple times, a level of violence that suggested a personal motive. But David had been a simple, hard-working man with no known enemies. The robbery seemed to be the primary motive, but the small amount of cash taken didn't seem to justify the level of violence. It was a contradiction that gnawed at Rossi. The initial investigation had hit a dead end. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage, no forensic evidence to speak of. The only lead was the ride-sharing app. The last ride had been requested by a user with a fake name and a burner phone. A dead end. But Rossi was not one to be easily discouraged. She was a detective with a reputation for her relentless pursuit of justice, her ability to see the patterns that others missed. She and her team spent countless hours poring over the data from the ride-sharing app, looking for any anomalies, any connections that might lead them to the killer. They cross-referenced the time and location of the ride request with cell phone tower data, a painstaking process that yielded thousands of potential numbers. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. But then they got a break. A sharp-eyed analyst on Rossi's team noticed a pattern. The burner phone that had been used to request the ride had been activated just hours before the murder, and it had been activated in the same cell tower zone as a phone registered to one Ethan Croft. It was a tenuous link, but it was a start. Rossi began to dig into Ethan's background. On the surface, he was the golden boy, the privileged son of a wealthy family with a bright future ahead of him. But as she delved deeper, a more complex picture began to emerge. She looked at his social media accounts, a curated feed of a life of extravagant consumption. And then, she saw it, the picture of the Audemars Piguet watch posted just a day after the murder. The caption, "For the one and only at Chloe Vance," was a taunt, a brazen display of a life lived without a care in the world. The price of the watch was $50,000. The motive, a puzzle that had been troubling Rossi from the beginning, suddenly clicked into place. This was not a simple robbery. This was a murder committed for the sake of a lifestyle, for the sake of appearances. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source. Rossi's team had been canvassing the area where the burner phone had been purchased, a small, nondescript electronics store in a part of the city that Ethan would have no reason to visit. The store owner, a man with a photographic memory, remembered the young man who had bought the phone. He had been polite, well-dressed, and he had paid in cash. And he had been driving a very expensive sports car, a car that the store owner had recognized from a magazine. It was the same make and model as the car registered to Ethan Croft. Rossi now had enough to bring him in for questioning. She knew she had to tread carefully. The Crofts were a powerful family, and they would not hesitate to use their influence to protect their son. But Rossi was not intimidated. She had a job to do, and she would not rest until she had gotten justice for David Chun. The net was closing in on Ethan, but he was oblivious, lost in his own world of denial and self-destruction. He continued to party, to spend money he didn't have, to create a smokescreen of normalcy that was becoming increasingly transparent. But the cracks in his facade were widening, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. The gilded cage he had so desperately tried to maintain was about to become a prison, and this time, there would be no escape. The arrest was a quiet, almost anticlimactic affair. 2 unmarked police cars pulled up to the Croft mansion as Ethan was about to leave for a weekend trip to the Hamptons with Chloe. Detective Rossi, dressed in a sharp, no-nonsense pantsuit, approached him as he was loading his designer luggage into the trunk of his sports car. "Ethan Croft?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, a hint of annoyance in his voice. He assumed it was about a speeding ticket, a minor inconvenience that his father's lawyers could easily take care of. "I'm Detective Rossi, Viridia Police Department," she said, flashing her badge. "I need you to come with me to answer some questions." The color drained from Ethan's face. He looked at Chloe, who was standing by the car, a look of confusion on her face. He tried to maintain his composure, to project an air of nonchalant confidence. "Is there a problem, Detective?" he asked, his voice a little shakier than he would have liked. "We're just trying to clear up a few things," Rossi said, her eyes never leaving his. "It's about the murder of a rideshare driver, David Chun." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. He stumbled back, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in an instant. The mask was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The interrogation room was a stark, windowless box, the only furniture a metal table and 3 chairs. Ethan sat opposite Rossi, his hands cuffed in front of him. His parents had hired the best lawyer in the city, a man with a reputation for getting his wealthy clients out of even the most difficult situations. But even he seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure in the face of Rossi's relentless questioning. Rossi laid out the evidence against Ethan, piece by piece, a suffocating mountain of irrefutable facts. The burner phone, the cell tower data, the store owner's testimony, the watch. Ethan denied everything, his voice a mixture of fear and bravado. But his denials grew weaker with each piece of evidence that Rossi presented. "I don't know what you're talking about," he insisted, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. "I was at a party that night. I have witnesses." "We've already spoken to your witnesses, Ethan," Rossi said, her voice a cold, hard edge. "Their stories don't quite add up. It's amazing how a little bit of pressure can jog a person's memory." The lawyer tried to intervene, to stop the questioning, but Rossi was relentless. She was a predator, and she had her prey cornered. The final blow came when Rossi placed a picture on the table. It was a picture of David Chun, a family photo taken at a birthday party. He was smiling, his arms around his wife and 2 children. They were a happy family, their faces radiating a simple, unpretentious joy. "This is the man you killed, Ethan," Rossi said, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its intensity. "This is the family you destroyed. All for what? A watch? A lifestyle? Was it worth it?" Something inside Ethan broke. The weight of his guilt, the terror of being caught, the sight of the family he had so callously torn apart, it was all too much. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob, a series of racking, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. The confession came in a torrent of words, a jumbled, incoherent stream of consciousness that laid bare the ugliness of his crime. He confessed to everything, the robbery, the murder, the cover-up. But there was no remorse in his words, no sense of guilt for the life he had taken. His only regret was that he had been caught. He was a spoiled, entitled child who had been denied nothing, and he could not comprehend a world where his actions had consequences. The trial was a media sensation, a lurid spectacle that captivated the city. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, with curious onlookers, with the friends and family of both the victim and the accused. The Crofts sat in the front row, their faces a mask of stoic grief, their immense wealth unable to buy their son his freedom. Across the aisle, Mei Chun sat with her 2 children, a portrait of quiet dignity in the face of unimaginable loss. She listened to the gruesome details of her husband's murder, her heart breaking a little more with each word. But she never shed a tear in the courtroom. She was there for her husband, to see that justice was done. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Ethan was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were a scathing indictment of a life lived without a moral compass, a life of shallow, materialistic pursuits that had ended in a brutal, senseless act of violence. As Ethan was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he looked at his parents, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. He had always believed that his family's money could protect him, that it could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But in the end, it was not enough. The gilded cage he had so desperately tried to maintain had become a real one, a cold, hard prison from which there would be no escape. Chloe was in the courtroom that day, a silent observer in the back row. She had broken up with Ethan after his arrest, the full extent of his depravity a shock to her system. She had been living in a bubble, a world of privilege and illusion, and David Chen's murder had been a brutal, eye-opening dose of reality. She had returned the watch, the symbol of a love that had been a lie, and she had decided to leave Viridia, to start a new life, a life of her own making, far from the suffocating world of her parents' expectations. The media frenzy eventually died down, the city moving on to the next sensational story. But for the Chen family, the pain would never truly go away. They had lost a husband, a father, a good and decent man, and their lives would be forever marked by his absence. But they had each other, and they had the memory of a man who had lived a life of quiet dignity, a life of love and family, a life that was richer than anything Ethan Croft could ever have imagined. They would heal, slowly but surely, their love for David a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. The price of a glittering cage had been a human life, a tragic reminder that the things that truly matter in this world can never be bought or sold.